perhaps faith and science shouldn't be in a sanctuary together, but we're going to break those stereotypes today and have a conversation and do this standard model of how to have a conversation.
You know, these problems still exist, and I want to treat that and help heal that. It's really powerful to me.
If you tune it up and you recognize and confess the tension that's there, perhaps you can create some beautiful music. So Whitney, we find ourselves here in the worship space of Holy Trinity Lutheran Church.
I know.
Our congregation, our church. And we're having a conversation between a minister and a scientist. And, you know, there's a stereotype out there, this false dichotomy that perhaps faith and science shouldn't be in a sanctuary together. But we're going to break those stereotypes today and have a conversation and do this standard model of how to have a conversation with one another. So I'm feeling pretty good.
It sounds great.
Sounds great. So every good story has an origin story, a good origin story. What is your origin story? Who is Dr. Robinson?
I often introduce myself by starting with my job, which maybe isn't the best way to ground one's identity, but I'm an epidemiologist. That's been really salient over the past 18 months. Yeah. But it also tells a lot about the way I think about the world. I love numbers and patterns and really trying to do some good in my own way through my vocation. I also say that I'm a Southerner. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and I grew up in South Georgia, and went away for college, but then came back from grad school and recruited a husband from Michigan. And so like my life is really grounded in the South, and that's what I think of as like my community and my people. I'm also a wife and a mother. I have 2 sons who are really fun, and actually got married in this space, and both my children were baptized in this space. And being part of this congregation means so much because it also makes me think not about myself only as a believer, but also my family, and really meaningful moments I've had here. And I'm a Christian, which is why I'm here. I'm a believer. And, you know, I was raised in a Lutheran church by, you know, my mom, who was raised in a Lutheran church by her parents in South Alabama. And, you know, those are my roots. And, you know, we were definitely a every week church, Sunday school, confirmation, tithing kind of family. And it was the pattern of our life. And as I went into young adulthood, even through college and grad school, I kept that as part of the pattern of my life. And that feels like right to me and very grounding to me.
Ah, that's awesome. And your oldest son, who is 6.
He is 6, almost 7.
Almost 7, asked really good questions during the children's messages. And even after the sermons, I've gotten a few great questions from your son. So we know he's listening, and he's going to grow up and ask some good questions in his life for sure.
I'm sure it'll make your life really fun.
Yeah, I love him. Can't wait till confirmation. It's going to be great. Yeah, that's great. So how did you discover Holy Trinity? How did you find this space to be your church and find us as a place you call home for your spiritual journey?
I came here for grad school. I was 21 years old, started grad school, and I think I just looked for the nearest Lutheran church. So it wasn't necessarily like, oh, I went through all the ratings of all the churches, but this was a really good community. It's physically close to me, but also a university community full of people who are, you know, seeking and trying to live out their faith. And it's been a good fit. And I've been really supported here, and it's fun to be the same church I was when I was 21 years old, and to have people who think of me as young.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
Well, tell us your research. What do you do with your research? What led you to this point? I guess your origin story of your interest in science. You've had this lifelong journey of faith, but then here comes this vocation of science. What led you to that? And then what are your research now? What keeps you going?
Yeah. I will tell you that, but then I want to turn the tables on you, and
Absolutely.
I want to hear more about you as a person
No, that's
why
coming.
you are
I'll be
here
happy.
as
Yep.
well.
Yeah, okay.
I always loved math and science as a kid. I did the Science Olympiad, and I just always really liked it. And I liked thinking about health and science, but I didn't want to touch people. Like a natural thing would be to be a doctor, but I was like, ugh, when you're a doctor, you have to like see people all the time.
Yeah.
And you can't just be like, I want to go off and daydream and think. Like you have to like see people and touch people. And I always like more having some quiet time to think about things and work through problems. And so I was like, I think I need to be a scientist. I don't want to be in a lab, like pipetting and running gels and stuff. And so when I discovered epidemiology and public health, it was great because it was like the statistics and the math and the pattern finding, and it had to do with health, but with a little bit of distance and thinking about the big picture more than like the person in front of you who needs immediate hands-on healing.
Yeah. So your
it.
research now, like what's happening there? I guess a 2-minute version of what you're doing now in your research. I guess, last 18 months in the global pandemic is go time, right?
Yeah. So like my normal research is actually about gynecologic health. And so I'm wearing my little necklace with like the uterus and ovaries on it because I love thinking about gynecologic health. But the pandemic was an all hands on deck kind of situation. And so I started doing a lot of COVID research as well, and actually had a study looking at levels of antibodies among people coming in for like routine prenatal testing, just as a way to monitor like, what are antibodies looking like in our local area? And that's been really cool. And I've learned a lot. I've stretched myself, started working with lab samples and infectious disease doctors and people I hadn't worked with. And I think I love learning and stretching myself and doing new things. And so that's been really gratifying. But it's like having a full-time job and then piling on another full-time job. And so it's been nice to feel useful.
Yeah.
I think that's a nice thing. It has been nice to feel like, okay, I have a way that I can be helpful. I can be helpful as a scientist. I can be helpful in answering questions to my family members and in my community, in my neighborhood. And that has been very gratifying. I feel like I left it all out on the field, but also like I'm really tired.
Yeah. And early on in the pandemic, we had a conversation we did for our congregation to talk about epidemiology and what's going on in our world and those kinds of things to help answer a question and help our congregation know that we have a member of our congregation who is working in this area to help the world become healthier and to respond in a healthy way to the pandemic. So I appreciate our conversations, 18 months. We're still having these conversations, but there at the beginning, that was enriching. So. Yeah.
Why don't you tell me about you? What's your story?
My origin story. Who is Will? Well, I tend to have that same temptation to lean right into what I do. But as I think about it, I'm this kind of a ball of relationships, So I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a dad. I have lots of friends. I'm also a pastor who's shepherding a community and with the good news of God's love and grace, trying to build community, build relationships, and how we can be faithful Christ followers in the world. So I'm a pastor, I'm a shepherd, I'm a minister, called to be here at Holy Trinity at the doorstep of University of North Carolina, an academic setting, but trying to help our congregation grow as a community, grow as disciples, and to become healthy Christ followers. So that's kind of where I am, this kind of ball of relationships and also who happens to be a pastor. I'm also a lifelong Lutheran. I grew up Lutheran in Wilmington, North Carolina, along the coast. So I'm a lifelong, grew up on the beach my entire life, lifelong surfer, lifelong beach bum, who also grew up in the church, who gave my Sunday school teachers and confirmation teachers a lot of headaches along the way. But it was when I was in high school, early college, that I started to take my faith a little bit more seriously. It's like, there's this guy, Jesus. I'm intrigued by this guy named Jesus. I'm entangled with his story and haunted by his story and love his story. So how does that affect my story? And so I had to think about how I'm gonna live that out in my daily life. So I actually thought marine biology down at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Hey, maybe I'll play with dolphins and surf the rest of my life. But after my first lab, I was like, wow, maybe like a C or maybe a C minus. I was like, maybe I need to rethink this. So thought sciences, and then I worked at a summer camp, Lutheran up in the North Carolina mountains, and and man, just seeing all different kinds of people and all different kinds of ages and different kinds of pastors, male, female, tall, short, introverts, extroverts. I was like, you know what? A somewhat clueless punk surfer kid could also be a pastor. And so I went down that direction of seminary. Became a Lutheran pastor and served a church in Florida, served a church in South Carolina, and now back in North Carolina. I've been here 10 years now, here at Holy Trinity, and things have gone well. There's never a dull moment when you're in a university setting, when you have campus ministry students and professors and scientists who are in your congregation, always asking great stories or asking great questions and sharing their stories of vocation. Keeps you on your toes. So very enriching context for ministry, for sure.
Do you feel like it feels like, the fact that I ended up here makes total sense, or does it feel more like unexpected?
Yeah, it is. It makes complete sense in a sense that my dad went to school here. My younger brother went to school here. I didn't, because I was going to play on the beach and go keep surfing in Wilmington. But the fact that I find myself here anyway is providential and ironic at the same time. And then someone who really kind of steered away from the sciences, because I didn't feel like I was equipped, or that was my calling in life, to be here in this setting where we have academics and professors, whether it's teaching or nursing or particle physics or epidemiology or astrophysics. I'm finding a setting where I'm shepherding these people and community to help them grow in their vocation and also grow in their faith at the same time. Yeah. That faith and science isn't necessarily two separate things, or that when you come to church here, you check your brain at the door because we're going to talk about something totally different, but it's a way that they can be integrated with one another as we go through life together as a community.
I want to know more about how you see this community. And we talking about like the story of this church, and I'm curious how you see it. Like, what do you think is the story of this church?
Well, its context has always been campus ministry. I mean, our setting and building is right here across the street from University of North Carolina, and it was founded as a campus ministry, taking care of students and helping them discern what their vocations could be and what their gifts are for the world. So how do you take your faith seriously and discern your gifts of how you can use those gifts in the world? So whether that's accounting or to become a doctor or to become an epidemiologist, how do you see those gifts growing and being used in the world? So that has always been our context. Coming here at first, I will say it was a little intimidating because, you know, as a pastor in a church and university setting with lots of professors and doctors, I'm not the smartest person in the room. And people ask some really good questions about whether it's the Bible or the world that we're all having to navigate. But then I quickly learned that I don't necessarily have to have all the answers, that I'm more intrigued by the answers than I am by the questions than I am the answers. So I'm more curious now. I guess in my younger days, I was more, infatuated with having the right answer. But now as I get older, it's being more curious and about what the questions are and what's the question behind the question. So I may not have all the answers or be the smartest person in the room in this building or when we do fellowship across the street. But I am pretty good with people, pretty good with relationships and asking good questions and connecting people with one another. And so being curious about people's questions and why they're asking them is a pretty thrilling and enriching part of my ministry here at Holy Trinity.
That's cool.
And I guess our history in engaging science here is that, we do have university students and even high school students and our confirmation students who do ask good questions as we all live in a world of a scientific point of view, that we all have little computers in our pockets. We understand that we are in an evolving universe, and when we look at the stars at night or trying to navigate the world at the news we see on TV or whatever we're streaming, how does our faith apply to that? So we want to be a safe place where people feel safe and brave to ask whatever questions they have. And so as a congregation, I've been committed to say, even though we may not have all the answers, or I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers, this is a safe space for you to ask whatever question you have, whatever that may be. And I guarantee you that you're not the first person to ask that question or the last person to ask that question. Whatever question you have, for thousands of years, people have been wrestling with these questions of human origins and what's our purpose in the world, and what's my place in this world? Is there good? What's good? What's evil? What's sin? What's brokenness? What's redemption? What does that look like across the board in all of our stories? And there's a lot of big questions that come up, and we want to make sure that this is a safe space for people to ask those questions. In fact, our history with engaging faith and science emerged from an event we call Grill Pastor Will, or Ask Pastor Will Anything, or a question and response time. So we just opened up a forum to have really of all ages, from teenagers all the way up to retirees. What questions do you have? And just to say, yeah, that's a good question. And I've read a good book on that, or heard a good podcast about that. I can steer in the right direction if I don't know the answer right off. But then that snowballed to some of the professors and scientists in our congregation to say, hey, I found a good book, and I'd love for us to read that together.
That feels very on brand.
Yeah. Let's read a book about it, right? I heard this podcast, and it's a good question. Let's listen together and do this. So then that evolved from like the Grill Pastor Will and kind of open forum question time to then a book study, to then us receiving a grant through Fuller Seminary and the Templeton Foundation. Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries gave us like a 2-year intentional time with resources and money to go deeper into the questions. And there, that blossomed in even more conversations about what we're doing. It even gave us a reputation in our synod and even in our church, our denomination, of a church that is engaging faith and science in a healthy way, and that others can do that as well.
Do you think that when scientists come through the doors or out into the parking lot outside on Sunday, that they're seeking something different or with a slightly different flavor than other people? Or do you think everybody's kind of seeking the same basic things from church? Or how do you think about that?
Well, we were having a conversation not too long ago. It's like, I want this space to be cutting edge and a place where we can ask all the questions that we have and grow deeper in our faith. But there's also that dynamic that I want people to be able to have Sabbath and rest too. Like you mentioned, you're tired, you've been working hard, and you need a place where you can catch your breath. And yeah, I want to ask you questions about your research and what's going on, but perhaps you need a time just to catch your breath and sing a hymn and say a prayer and see the bigger picture of the world through the lens of Scripture. But I also don't want people to feel like they need to check their vocation or brains at the door, that this can engage not just their heart or kind of what they're feeling in spirituality, but also their brains as well. And so yeah, I'm hoping that we can have some stimulating sermons and conversations about science, but also a place where people can catch their breath and look at one another across the room and say, yeah, they're part of my family of faith as well. Yeah. And it can be intimidating being in a university setting because there's always something going on an issue or a hot topic or a university student wrestling with something. But to let them know that this is a safe place to not only catch their breath, but also ask the big questions is really what we hope to do in this space.
I think I made it like 18 minutes or so before I started crying.
Okay. Well, tell me what stimulated the tears or the emotion? What did you hear that brought that feeling or emotion up in you?
So some of it's just personality. I actually think I started crying when I think Pastor Mark was doing some of our wedding counseling and I started crying. And he's like, okay. But I think that idea of Sabbath, like, this is one of the few spaces, I think, in my world that's like, like that deep care and Sabbath and rest, and to remind you that you are valued and you are a child of God no matter what you do. If you stopped today, if you never wrote another paper, if you never, did anything else of note, like, you deserve rest. You are God's child. There's something really powerful about it to me. And I think in this moment where things do feel so intense and high pressure, and where I feel a strong sense of vocation, but also know that there has to be a counterbalance with rest that just really resonated with me.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think one of the challenges being in this community is, there's a lot of resources, a lot of gifts, and a lot of alpha males and females who are at the top of their classrooms and research, and they're go, 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 success all the time, and busy, busy, busy. I do want this a place where even if all that went away, that you would feel valued and a part of a community and a family of faith. And so perhaps this can be a place where, in the parking lot, I may have a question about what you're doing, but it could also be like, how are you doing? Do you need me to challenge you to take a break and take a Sabbath and a day off and to respect that time and boundaries as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. As a congregation, how have you seen us engage science? Has it been helpful for you, or perhaps what could we do better in that realm?
I mean, I think one thing is like the resources. Like, this place is full of nurses, and it's always great to be in a place that's full of nurses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have, in a research triangle, we have Duke Medical, yes. We have UNC Healthcare, we have Wake Med and Raleigh. So we have this research triangle where some of the best hospitals in the nation is right here. Yeah.
So just literally I had a really hard pregnancy, my first pregnancy, and I had a complication, and there were people waiting to care for me in many ways, but also just with expertise and, you need this, you need that. And so that is a nice way to be able to draw from the gifts of the community. And I think every church community has gifts, and being in a community like this, the people who know how to do research and know how to find things is one source of gifts. Just the connections and the knowingness, because I've been here 20 years and I really value those long-term connections. I am also a people person.
Yeah.
And I love people and I really value relationships. And so having those long-term relationships of knowing people who know me, who know my family, who would ask, how's your dissertation going? But not in a way that made me mad, because sometimes you can ask that question and it can feel like pressure.
Right.
But in genuine curiosity and giving advice and care is nice. And, literally just praying for us, being there for us, celebrating for us. I think a lot of those are common to a lot of churches, but, the extra flavor of it here from others, and also the emphasis on rest and a time apart and Sabbath and music. I love singing, and just the full body expression of faith physically. I spend so many hours of the day sitting at a computer or talking to people or then back at my computer, and just the pulling out of that space, going to a different space, sitting, standing, singing, engaging in the ritual, I think is really important to just ground me in other parts of my humanity and value.
Yeah. And I guess that's been so hard and challenging during the pandemic, is that we've had this space taken away from us, or where the music that this virus has spread through air particles as people sing, and these relationships of people that we're so connected to and long to be with and be a part of our daily journey, or hold us accountable and remind us who we are and how valuable we are, then that's taken away, or we're distanced from that. That's been challenging for the last year and a half. But yet the church is nimble, and all those spaces that we feel like, oh man, could we ever figure out how to do a live stream or use technology to do these things? We adapt and we grow and evolve as a community to find ways that we can keep those relationships going in the midst of that. Can
I turn the question around on you?
Sure.
So how have you been supported by this community?
Well, I think, as a minister, I'm hyper-focused on taking care of the flock. So I have to be more reminded and held accountable, too, to say, Will, where are you taking your Sabbath? Where are you taking your break? Where do you feel enriched in your faith? You're not just preaching really in others. Where do you get that from in other aspects of your life? And I'll say that our engagement with faith and science through the STEAM grant is one of the most enriching things that's ever been a part of my life and ministry, because of the relationships and the curiosity around these areas of science and research that I really didn't know about, that I have an opportunity to grow in and figure out how that integrates with my faith and life. Those have been just very stimulating and enriching in my life. But I think, a big part of my week and rhythm of the week is a build up to Sunday, and then you rest, and then you build up to another Sunday, and trying to create an authentic, enriching experience for people to worship God, encounter the gospel, to be reminded again that their value isn't attached to that grant or their success or the grade they make in that class, but they are valued by God unconditionally, no strings attached. And so to remind people of that on a weekly basis is what keeps me going. And then, the pandemic's been hard because we haven't been the same way. We've been live streaming. We're looking at cameras. Yeah. We're speaking to people, literally to people around the world. It's expanded our reach and our walls. There's a story of someone who's going to come over on a student visa from Germany, but couldn't make it over because of COVID, stayed in Switzerland. She watched us on YouTube for a year on YouTube. If I would have known that someone was watching us in Switzerland, I would have been a little bit more nervous. But then she was able to come back over here to school this year. Wow. And come into our worship space and meet us face to face, which was really, really neat. And I'm a people person too, extrovert, who likes to see. I can look across our congregation on a Sunday and see that, Whitney's usually has a smile on her face, and she usually bubbly and hot from her perspective. With this particular Sunday, she doesn't have a smile. She looks like she's caring a little bit. I can follow up that week and say, how are you doing? You didn't look like you were yourself that week. And but that was taken away from me during this pandemic, because people can see me, but I can't see them. So I'd be more intentional. The pastor's anxiety is that there's always someone I'm not paying attention to that I should be. Mm-hmm. And during the pandemic, that's made it even harder, because I'm having to guess if people aren't letting me know. So we've all had to be more intentional about our needs and what we need as a community and as a pastor. So, and of course, I know your husband well. We love geeky things and sci-fi, and to have things not necessarily, again, faith every day, or it's faith every day, but not necessarily working on a sermon every day, or making a hospital visit every day, or engaging this or that, but also having an outlet of hobbies. And whether it's Star Wars or Marvel Comics or the Marvel MCU, those things are outlets to let our creativity and imaginations flow as well.
Honestly, that was one of the things that was most exciting when you were coming here, when we knew you were coming. We all, I Googled you and I saw that you had done this comic book thing, and I told my husband, who I guess was my boyfriend or fiance then, I was trying to get him pumped up about church. And so I feel like you showing up as your full self and bringing in your interests helped make this connection, which is great.
And I think that's a part of, as we engage faith and science and vocations, is to be our true selves and be authentic and honest with who we are, what creates energy within us, what we're passionate about, but also being honest about what we wrestle with and the questions that we have, and just to be honest and authentic with one another, and create a safe and brave space where we can be that for one another. So I guess it didn't take me too long to make a Star Wars reference.
I do like that. I also like Pastor Mark's sermons, one of our other our campus pastor, because sometimes he'll start talking about building something. He was talking about plumb lines or something, and it had a biblical reference, but then he actually started talking about building something, and I think he got lost or something. Anyway, it's fun to see that part of, the staff too. Yeah,
we all geek out on something, right?
Yes. Yep. I geeked out with him about COVID protocols the other day, and it was awesome.
Yeah. Are you talking about the what levels?
The CO2 levels in here, and he's anyway. Yes. He's done a lot, and it's cool. I was going to ask you, so how did you make those pandemic decisions? Because you're I love the people, I love the relationships, I love getting together. How did you balance that?
Yeah, I think first of all that we are a science-believing congregation and have a lot of scientists and nurses and doctors who were advising us, and we were putting on our listening ears to say all right, how are we going to create, how are we not going to put our people at risk and keep our congregation healthy while still being able to express who we are as a church body and as we grow in our faith. And I'll be honest, the pandemic was apocalyptic in a sense of the Greek word meaning to reveal. It revealed three things that the church doesn't necessarily have a very good record on, and that is science, race, and how to be the church without a building to gather in. So those areas really pushed us to rethink and reevaluate and reform how we respond to science, race, and how to use our building or not use our building. And so that pushed us for that. And so we had people who were experts in the field that we were listening to. Another great thing that happened out of this is that all the churches on Franklin Street, we have every denomination you can think of, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Catholic, all on Franklin Street there at the doorstep of UNC. And from the very get-go of the pandemic, we had a weekly Zoom meeting for us to think about, let's all be on the same page. It doesn't mean that we all have to do YouTube, or we all have to do Facebook Live, or that we all have to do it this way in terms of worship, but maybe we all close our doors at the same time and be with one collective voice about how we can keep people safe. And we had a member of University Methodist Church who is director of emergency medicine at UNC Hospital, who was our weekly consultant of giving us the COVID numbers and giving us suggestions and recommendations of what to do or not do. And then as we would lament together, we would grieve together, we'll shake our fist at God together, shake our fist at the political leaders together, or whatever it is that week that we're like, what are we doing? But then also come together and say, you know what? Like I remind y'all that if you take away your grant or your grade in literature, that you're still a beloved child of God. We don't have this building anymore. Well, guess what? You're still a beloved child of God, and God is still with us in the midst of these things. So that's been going on for 18 months, a weekly Zoom meeting of these ministers and some medical experts talking, discerning, wrestling with these big questions that the rest of the world is wrestling with.
I hadn't thought that much about that vulnerability. So in my world, I need to write research grants and get the papers out, or like my job is at risk. So it has, real consequences. And I think for churches, like kind of growing and having your donations and all that stuff, like that's real. That feels like a test of faith.
Yeah. And it's been hard. So churches that wrestled with that or did it a different way or felt like they needed to stay open the whole time because they are scared or nervous or had the anxiety that we're just going to die and this is going to be taken away from us. Change is hard, and that insecurity and not feeling safe, people do a lot of crazy, weird things when they're grieving or they're scared. And so other churches and denominations are responding the best way they know how. And so I'm thankful that our synod and our bishop was very supportive, and along the way, along with the weekly local clergy, we've also had our national bishop and our North Carolina bishop who have had a task force to guide and help congregations along the way. In a polarized, divided world, I'm very thankful that our congregation has been pretty unified on most things, but I know it's hard for a lot of churches out there that are wrestling and who to listen to. A lot of information. Which scientists do I listen to? What is this going on? This person I look up to is saying something different from this other. How do I navigate? And I think that's where those relationships are important. And so what brought us into this church and journey of what's important to us in our relationships, that's what's going to happen or what's going to help us grow in the days ahead. Yeah. And so our kind of way of doing this standard model conversation between a minister and a scientist is to encourage other congregations to keep having those conversations. And if they're not having those conversations, look for ways to have that conversations and build those relationships. Because maybe your church isn't on the doorstep of a major university. Maybe you don't have a epidemiologist in your congregation or a doctor of particle physics in your congregation, but maybe you have a middle school chemistry teacher. Maybe you have a high school engineer, professor or teacher that you can talk to that can open up conversation with your young disciples, old disciples, and just create that space that people can ask the questions, because those questions aren't going anywhere. Yeah. We can ignore them, we can stick our head in the sand, but the big questions people are wrestling with aren't going anywhere.
I think one of the hardest things for me as a scientist is where science and politics butt heads. And I think one great thing about being a Christian involved in religious community is it has always informed my science, and that I know that, the research is one thing, but when you're making decisions, it's all about the context. So you have the research, but it's through the lens of, okay, what are other values that people have? And so sometimes people might take the same science and make different decisions. And so I think that's made me better as a scientist and as a science communicator, and definitely as far as COVID and other things, I think about like bringing in that context and thinking about like other values people have besides, was this statistically significant in this study? And I think that makes me think about a lot of questions we approach in the church. There's so many questions that are questions about politics and values and science all mixed together. And I think that can be hard. And I feel like I've seen this church and you in this church engage more in those kinds of questions in the past 18 months or so. And is that your perspective?
Yeah, I think in the before times, I think there is a sense of complacency. We're all doing our thing. We have our weekly routines. But again, this pandemic has shaken us out of complacency. We need to pay attention to these things that are important. As a denomination and church body that's mostly white, with things that have happened, we need to pay more attention and listen more about what we have done or haven't done in terms of race and racism. When it comes to science, when it comes to gender, when it comes to all those issues that are important, we're like, all right, I hate that it's taken this to wake us up a little bit, but we need to listen to this and pay attention to what's going on. And I don't know if you know this, Whitney, but there's politics in church too. Yeah. I mean, we're an organization that has committees and budgets and people with opinions about what we do with our time and gifts. But my job is also to remind us that we're not just an organization, but we're also an organism that is a body with gifts that can work together. And how do you keep that healthy, and how do we move forward in this world? So all that is a part of our journey as well. And and I'm learning more and more as a minister to listen more and speak less too, which is often hard, which may not have seen on this interview. But how do we put on our listening ear to what's going on in the world around us and engaging those?
I've appreciated it because as a scientist, I do stuff in gynecology and reproductive health, which can be very political. I do stuff about race and racism in health, and COVID and weighing in on kids and schools and everything. And so I often have strong beliefs that are informed by my position as a scientist and tempered by trying to think about the context and other people's values. And I do feel more like, oh, okay, maybe I can bring more of that self into church.
Yeah, and if politics means our common life together, how do we navigate our common life together as a community who come from different areas or backgrounds? And I think it's also important to define terms. We come into church, we come in these spaces of science, and we don't just assume that we all understand what we mean when we say God. We don't all understand what we mean when we say evolution. We all don't know, or we may have these stereotypes of what we mean when we even say politics. But to make sure we come on a common ground, let's talk about these big words or ideas or concepts are together, and define these together, or come to a common ground and understanding of what those mean, so that we can have some healthy conversation around it.
That is nice. And I think it's a mark of grace to be like, okay, let's just start here. And if you have questions, I'm going to take it on good faith that your question is in good faith. I feel like so many times just outside in regular life, even if somebody has a question, sometimes you're like, are you trolling me? Is it a real question?
What's the question behind the question behind the question? Which is why Jesus often responded to questions with a question, to get behind the question that's behind the question. Yeah.
So you mentioned the STEAM grant,
right?
Which is exciting that you all did that. And so can you tell me more about it and how it enriched the life of the congregation?
Yeah, like I said, we had these conversations and Q&As and question and responses and book studies around faith and science. And then here came this opportunity where this organization was going to give us money to go deeper into the subject and be more intentional with how we're doing it. We started off with our kind of grant title or project title as reconciling the tension between faith and science in a university setting. We were very proud of that title. And then we brought in a famous podcaster and author, and we had lunch with him, and we're sitting down talking, and I was so proud of that title. I was like, hey, yeah, our project is called Reconciling the Tension Between Faith and Science in a University Setting. And he was like, why do you want to reconcile the tension? And I went, what? And he was like, why do you want to reconcile the tension? I was like, because I don't like conflict. Because tension and conflict make me uncomfortable. Why I want to reconcile it? And he was like, no. And he reshaped this vision. He was like, well, when you have a musical instrument and there's tension on the line, you can't have music without tension on that string. You know, it's when it's out of tune that people do not want to hear an out of tune violin. They're like, that's the word. So when there's this out of tune tension between faith and science, then people don't want to listen to that. It turns people off. It's like, then they don't want to be a part of that conversation. But if you tune it up and you recognize and confess the tension that's there, perhaps you can create some beautiful music that we can dance to, that we can listen to together. So we switched and pivoted that by saying it's not reconciling the tension, but embracing the tension and trying to create a healthier conversation between faith and science. And so our big idea was we're going to reconcile the tension and we're going to answer all the questions for our university students. And then we had to pump the brakes and say, maybe that's not our goal. Maybe it's just starting small and bringing students in and saying, what are your questions? We're not going to answer any questions today. We just want to know what your questions are. This is no bait and switch. We're not going to tell you you're wrong or shame you for having that question. We just really legitimately want to know what your questions are. We create the list. And I remember one student, as another student was asking a question about age of the universe and Genesis 1 and 2, and how can this fit together, and how does God's story wrestle with our story, and da-da-da. And he just sat there and leaned over to one of our project leaders and said, I thought I was the only one with that question. He was like, no, people have been asking that question forever. And he's like, oh, I feel so validated. I'm not alone. And so we started off, then we started like, oh, let's embrace these questions and then figure out ways to give resources to help people with the questions that they have. Not that we're going to answer it all, but man, there's just so many resources. Yeah. And so we were just the tip of the iceberg of the books and the professors and the teachers and the pastors that have really wrestled with these questions, that we're able to give others and say, look, you're not alone in this. And here are ways that people have navigated them or danced to that music of the tension in their own lives. I guess what we could have done better or done differently, at the end of the grant, you finish your grant and they're like, we have these other big goals, but then people kind of go back to what they normally do in the routine. So we still engage those questions. Mm-hmm. We still have faith and science in our budget as a part of our faith formation budget line items, to be intentional with that. But then people often in our world, there's one thing or the next, we get caught up and busy. And so how do we focus? And I guess the challenge for every minister is everybody's busy. But how do you get people to use or inspire people to have their volunteer time to help the church, but also give them Sabbath and not? So that's kind of where we are with that. But all in all, I mean, we still it has set a tone and a reputation for our congregation that we are a congregation that's a safe and brave space to ask those questions, and we have some pretty good resources that we can point in direction and what those questions are.
Okay. That was very cool.
What did you notice on that time? You were here through some of that. You weren't necessarily on that project team. You were doing other things, like there's kids and life and a marriage. But what did you notice of that time? Was there anything that stood out for you, or is there things that we could have done better at that time? Or what do you see that we could do leading forward in this?
I kind of remember, and I remember some of the events, and I went to some of them, and a lot of it was like physics and astrophysics and like the universe stuff. And that's not like really my thing.
Okay.
I'm more like very relational. I'm into the like meat of like human relationships. I love a memoir. And so, when I think about science, I'm more thinking about kind of maybe, psychology and neuropsych and all those like relational pieces.
Right.
And so I was like, okay, that's cool. But, like the questions I have are probably of a different flavor. And some of that could be season of life. I feel like, my son, who is 6 and 7, I think he's very interested in this question of like, who made the universe? And like, all of like the big questions. And, he thinks about dinosaurs and time and space and stuff.
Love it so much.
And I wonder if like during this time of my life where I'm just deep in like the mothering and even caring for my students and my husband, like I'm very bound in kind of the relational. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that we leaned into the big questions of like the cosmos and kind of those big questions, but then what about the social sciences and relational or science of the mind, sociology, those kind of questions. We do tend to gravitate towards those things we're most interested in. Of course, being a big sci-fi geek, I'm thinking of like, maybe there was a galaxy far, far away at some point where people had magical Jedi powers. I don't know. I don't know. Second Star Wars reference. Ding. But then, maybe what are other areas of science? It's not just cosmology or quantum physics, the stuff that Will geeks out on, but what are other areas that people are in, whether it's a social science, relationships, community, that kind of thing that we could grow into and ask those questions.
It makes me think a little bit about why I love like gynecology as a field. And I just made a switch to a department of OBGYN where I'm still doing epidemiology, but I'm working with a lot of clinicians who like do prenatal care and perinatal care and, deal with people who are, having gynecologic problems or even going through menopausal transition. And I feel really called towards that population. I mean, I just think, you think about Jesus as a baby, like you think about, people who are pregnant being really vulnerable and like, young families and that process and healthy pregnancy and, shepherding in new life and bringing that in a healthy way. And so that's really powerful to me. It feels very in tune with my faith. And then also gynecologic conditions, like so many, women especially will have like fibroids or endometriosis or infertility problems and just all these things that I feel like often aren't talked about, even in this day and age. I mean, these are common problems, they're medical problems, but so often people don't have a lot of support around that. And so I really love this area of research, and often it's overlooked. And I even think about, the woman in the Bible who wanted to touch the hem of Jesus' garment because she had bleeding. And it sounds so much like, the kind of, bleeding from fibroids or abnormal uterine bleeding that we're still trying to figure out and treat. And so I just feel a real kinship with that population and those problems, because those are problems that have, the problems of infertility and bleeding and gynecologic disorders. Like to see that in the Bible and think, these problems still exist and I want to treat that and help heal that is really powerful to me.
Yeah, I think the word I'll pick up there is kinship, a kinship with a positive. And I think when we think about our stories, we talk about our origin story and our faith stories and our vocational stories, where do we feel kinship with and connect with? And I think that's just a strong word. So when your life is entangled with this Jesus story as a part of your faith, so do you feel that supporting and guides you in this? Is that something you think about beyond just Sunday morning Sabbath, but each day as you go out into the world? Is there something there that brings to mind? You brought up that story of the touching just the hem of his cloak. That's a pretty powerful story.
No, I think that I don't do I used to be really good at my daily Bible reading, and I have gotten bad at it. I'm trying to get back into better habits.
Right.
But yeah, I feel like that's so baked into me, and that's like probably a credit to my mother. I think that practice of hearing the stories on the 3-year cycle. We're very liturgical.
We have our 3-year revised common lectionary.
On our cycle, I'm like, I've heard that story before.
Yep. How is Will or Mark or Holly gonna preach on that one this time? Yep.
And being here for 20 years, I've heard probably some of the same people preach on these, and there's something beautiful about it. I think about, you hear stories about older people who maybe even have dementia and have forgotten people in their lives even, but who can still remember those prayers and those songs.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I'm grateful that's like deep within me.
Yeah. So when in the twilight of our years, that will stick as well. That is baked in, as you said, into who we are and our identity and how we wrestle with and navigate the world that we're in.
Yeah. And so I want to give my children that as well. So even when you might not have the presence of mind to remember, oh, I need to pray, that it's kind of deep in there and it'll call to you, even if you can't remember to call to it.
Right. Yeah, that's strong. Like even our oldest daughter, Hannah, is in college, and I think she even mentioned to her mom, I even off at college, she was like, I haven't been to church in a while. I'm gonna go to Holy Trinity Raleigh, because she's right around the corner. And she's like, I need to get in. She went on her own, and we were like, oh, yeah, because we passed that on to the next stage. And it doesn't mean that she doesn't have questions or doubts or wrestling with her identity or whatever's going on in the world, like we all have. But that rhythm and community and what stories are we engaged in that help ground us, and that's what we want to do here is lift up this Jesus story that valued people who they were, what they were doing in their lives, and steer them in the direction and remind them over and over again that they are a child of God. Well, Whitney, I value this conversation so much and value you as a person and your gifts and all the relationships that you embody in your life and how much you mean to this community of faith. And we'll keep on this journey of being Jesus followers together, along with our vocations and how we navigate a world that can often be complicated and hard, but knowing you and your gifts and you being a part of this congregation brings levity to that and helps me as a minister and as a person who is a disciple of Jesus.
I'm really glad to be here. First of all, it got me out of work because I'm like, ooh, I have like something fun to do at lunchtime. So thank you for that. And I'm just so like happy our paths have intersected. It's kind of a beautiful thing about going on through life and thinking about who God's going to put in your life. And you've become an integral part of the story of my life and my family's life. Grateful for that.
I'm grateful too. And I know that we'll keep the conversation going and encourage others out there in their contexts and their ministries and their congregations to create conversations like this, and that this isn't like the end. It's just like, hey, we're going to have this conversation a little bit later down the road over coffee or a beer or talking about a Marvel movie or a Star Wars movie. That's the third reference.
Have you seen Shang-Chi? Yes.
Oh, yes, I have.
We'll talk about it after.
We'll talk about it after. Yeah. More places and spaces where we can talk about those things we geek out on. Faith, science, and geeky things.
Yes.
So thank you for you.
Thank you.